2 Kings. 2 Kings chapter 1. Soon after King Ahab of Israel died, the country of Moab rebelled against his son King Ahaziah. One day Ahaziah fell through the wooden slats around the porch on the flat roof of his palace in Samaria, and he was badly injured. So he sent some messengers to the town of Ekron with orders to ask the god Beelzebub if he would get well. About the same time, an angel from the Lord sent Elijah the prophet from Tishbe to say to the king's messengers,
Ahaziah has rejected Israel's own God by sending you to ask Beelzebub about his injury. Tell him that because he has done this, he's on his deathbed.
And Elijah did what he was told. When the messengers returned to Ahaziah, he asked,
"Why are you back so soon?"
"A man met us along the road with a message for you from the Lord."
They answered.
"The Lord wants to know why you sent us to ask Beelzebub about your injury, and why you don't believe there's a God in Israel. The man also told us that the Lord says you're going to die."
What did the man look like?
Ahaziah asked.
"He was hairy and had a leather belt around his waist."
They answered.
It must be Elijah,
replied Ahaziah. So at once he sent an army officer and 50 soldiers to meet Elijah. Elijah was sitting on top of a hill at the time. The officer went up to him and said,
"Man of God, the king orders you to come down and talk with him."
"If I am a man of God,"
Elijah answered,
"God will send down fire on you and your 50 soldiers."
Fire immediately came down from heaven and burned up the officer and his men. Ahaziah sent another officer and 50 more soldiers to Elijah. The officer said,
"Man of God, the king orders you to come see him right now."
"If I am a man of God,"
Elijah answered,
"fire will destroy you and your 50 soldiers."
And God sent down fire from heaven on the officer and his men. Ahaziah sent a third army officer and 50 more soldiers. This officer went up to Elijah. Then he got down on his knees and begged,
"Man of God, please be kind to me and these 50 servants of yours. Let us live. Fire has already wiped out the other officers and their soldiers. Please don't let it happen to me."
The angel from the Lord said to Elijah,
Go with him, and don't be afraid.
So Elijah got up and went with the officer. When Elijah arrived, he told Ahaziah,
"The Lord wants to know why you sent messengers to Ekron to ask Beelzebub about your injury. Don't you believe there's a God in Israel? Ahaziah, because you did that, the Lord says you will die."
Ahaziah died just as the Lord had said. But since Ahaziah had no sons, Joram his brother then became king. This happened in the 2nd year that Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat, was king of Judah. Everything else Ahaziah did while he was king is written in the history of the kings of Israel. 2 Kings chapter 2. Not long before the Lord took Elijah up into heaven in a strong wind, Elijah and Elisha were leaving Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha,
"The Lord wants me to go to Bethel, but you must stay here."
Elisha replied,
"I swear by the living Lord and by your own life that I will stay with you no matter what."
And he went with Elijah to Bethel. A group of prophets who lived there asked Elisha,
"Do you know that today the Lord is going to take away your master?"
"Yes, I do,"
Elisha answered.
"But don't remind me of it."
Elijah then said,
"Elisha, now the Lord wants me to go to Jericho, but you must stay here."
Elisha replied,
"I swear by the living Lord and by your own life that I will stay with you no matter what."
And he went with Elijah to Jericho. A group of prophets who lived there asked Elisha,
"Do you know that today the Lord is going to take away your master?"
"Yes, I do,"
Elisha answered.
"But don't remind me of it."
Elijah then said to Elisha,
"Now the Lord wants me to go to the Jordan River, but you must stay here."
Elisha replied,
I swear by the living Lord and by your own life that I will never leave you.
So the two of them walked on together. 50 prophets followed Elijah and Elisha from Jericho, then stood at a distance and watched as the two men walked toward the river. When they got there, Elijah took off his coat. Then he rolled it up and struck the water with it. At once a path opened up through the river, and the two of them walked across on dry ground. After they had reached the other side, Elijah said,
Elisha, the Lord will soon take me away. What can I do for you before that happens?
Elisha answered,
Please, give me twice as much of your power as you give the other prophets, so I can be the one who takes your place as their leader.
It won't be easy, Elijah answered. It can happen only if you see me, as I'm being taken away.
Elijah and Elisha were walking along and talking, when suddenly there appeared between them a flaming chariot pulled by fiery horses. Right away a strong wind took Elijah up into heaven. Elisha saw this and shouted,
Israel's cavalry and chariots have taken my master away.
After Elijah had gone, Elisha tore his clothes in sorrow. Elijah's coat had fallen off, so Elisha picked it up and walked back to the Jordan River. He struck the water with the coat and wondered,
Will the Lord perform miracles for me as he did for Elijah?
As soon as Elisha did this, a dry path opened up through the water and he walked across. When the prophets from Jericho saw what happened, they said to each other,
Elisha now has Elijah's power.
They walked over to him, bowed down, and said,
There are 50 strong men here with us. Please let them go look for your master. Maybe the Spirit of the Lord carried him off to some mountain or valley.
No,
Elisha replied.
They won't find him.
They kept begging until he was embarrassed to say no. He finally agreed, and the prophet sent the men out. They looked 3 days for Elijah, but never found him. They returned to Jericho, and Elisha said,
I told you that you wouldn't find him.
One day the people of Jericho said,
Elisha, you can see that our city is in a good spot, but the water from our spring is so bad that it even keeps our crops from growing.
He replied,
Put some salt in a new bowl and bring it to me.
They brought him the bowl of salt, and he carried it to the spring. He threw the salt into the water and said,
The Lord has made this water pure again. From now on you'll be able to grow crops, and no one will starve.
The water has been fine ever since, just as Elisha said. Elisha left and headed toward Bethel. Along the way, some boys started making fun of him by shouting,
Go away, Baldy! Get out of here!
Elisha turned around and stared at the boys. Then he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Right away, 2 bears ran out of the woods and ripped to pieces 42 of the boys. Elisha went up to Mount Carmel, then returned to Samaria. 2 Kings, chapter 3. Joram son of Ahab became king of Israel in Jehoshaphat's 18th year as king of Judah. Joram ruled 12 years from Samaria and disobeyed the Lord by doing wrong. He tore down the stone image his father had made to honor Baal, and so he wasn't as sinful as his parents. But he kept doing the sinful things that Jeroboam son of Nebat had led Israel to do. For many years, the country of Moab had been controlled by Israel and was forced to pay taxes to the kings of Israel. King Nisha of Moab raised sheep, so he paid the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and the wool from 100,000 rams. But soon after the death of Ahab, Nisha rebelled against Israel. One day Joram left Samaria and called together Israel's army. He sent this message to King Jehoshaphat of Judah.
The king of Moab has rebelled. Will you go with me to attack him?
Yes, I will,
Jehoshaphat answered.
I am on your side, and my soldiers and horses are at your command. But which way should we go?
We will march through Edom Desert.
Joram replied. So Joram, Jehoshaphat, and the king of Edom led their troops out. But 7 days later there was no drinking water left for them or their animals. Joram cried out,
This is terrible. The Lord must have led us out here to be captured by Moab's army.
Jehoshaphat said,
Which of the Lord's prophets is with us? We can find out from him what the Lord wants us to do.
One of Joram's officers answered,
Elisha son of Shaphat is here. He was one of Elijah's closest followers.
Jehoshaphat replied,
He could give us the Lord's message.
The three kings went over to Elisha, and he asked Joram,
Why did you come to me? Go talk to the prophets of the foreign gods your parents worshipped.
No,
Joram answered.
It was the Lord who led us out here so that Moab's army could capture us.
Elisha said to him,
I serve the Lord all-powerful, and as surely as he lives, I swear I wouldn't even look at you if I didn't respect King Jehoshaphat.
Then Elisha said,
Send for someone who can play the harp.
The harpist began playing, and the Lord gave Elisha this message for Joram.
The Lord says that this dry riverbed will be filled with water. You won't feel any wind or see any rain, but there will be plenty of water for you and your animals. That simple thing isn't all the Lord is going to do. He will also help you defeat Moab's army. You will capture all their walled cities and important towns. You will chop down every good tree and stop up every spring of water, then ruin their fertile fields by covering them with rocks.
The next morning, while the sacrifice was being offered, water suddenly started flowing from the direction of Edom, and it flooded the land. Meanwhile, the people of Moab had heard that the three kings were coming to attack them. They had called together all of their fighting men, from the youngest to the oldest, and these troops were now standing at their border ready for battle. When they got up that morning, the sun was shining across the water, making it look red. The Moabite troops took one look and shouted,
Look at that blood! The armies of those kings must have fought and killed each other. Come on, let's go take what's left in their camp.
But when they arrived at Israel's camp, the Israelite soldiers came out and attacked them until they turned and ran away. Israel's army chased them all the way back to Moab, and even there they kept up the attack. The Israelites destroyed the Moabite towns. They chopped down the good trees and stopped up the springs of water, then covered the fertile fields with rocks. Finally, the only city left standing was Kir-Hareseth, but soldiers armed with slings surrounded and attacked it. King Mesha of Moab saw that he was about to be defeated, so he took along 700 soldiers with swords and tried to break through the front line where the Edomite troops were positioned, but he failed. He then grabbed his oldest son, who was to be the next king, and sacrificed him as an offering on the city wall. The Israelite troops were so horrified that they left the city and went back home. 2 Kings chapter 4. One day the widow of one of the Lord's prophets said to Elisha,
You know that before my husband died, he was a follower of yours and a worshipper of the Lord. But he owed a man some money, and now that man is on his way to take my 2 sons as his slaves.
Maybe there's something I can do to help.
Elisha said.
What do you have in your house?
Sir, I have nothing but a small bottle of olive oil.
Elisha told her,
Ask your neighbors for their empty jars, and after you've borrowed as many as you can, go home and shut the door behind you and your sons. Then begin filling the jars with oil, and set each one aside as you fill it.
The woman left. Later, when she and her sons were back inside their house, the 2 sons brought her the jars, and she began filling them. At last she said to one of her sons,
Bring me another jar.
We don't have any more.
He answered, and the oil stopped flowing from the small bottle. After she told Elisha what had happened, he said,
Sell the oil, and use part of the money to pay what you owe the man. You and your sons can live on what is left.
Once, while Elisha was in the town of Shunem, he met a rich woman who invited him to her home for dinner. After that, whenever he was in Shunem, he would have a meal there with her and her husband. Sometime later, the woman said to her husband,
I'm sure the man who comes here so often is a prophet of God. Why don't we build him a small room on the flat roof of our house? We can put a bed, a table and chair, and an oil lamp in it. Then, whenever he comes, he can stay with us.
The next time Elisha was in Shunem, he stopped at their house and went up to his room to rest. He said to his servant Gehazi,
"This woman has been very helpful. Have her come up here to the roof for a moment."
She came, and Elisha told Gehazi to say to her, "You've gone to a lot of trouble for us, and we want to help you. Is there something we can request the king or army commander to do?" The woman answered,
With my relatives nearby, I have everything I need.
"Then what can we do for her?"
Elisha asked Gehazi. Gehazi replied, "I do know that her husband is old and that she doesn't have a son. Ask her to come here again," Elisha told his servant. He called for her, and she came and stood in the doorway of Elisha's room. Elisha said to her,
"Next year at this time, you'll be holding your own baby son in your arms."
You're a man of God.
The woman replied.
Please, don't lie to me.
But a few months later, the woman got pregnant. She gave birth to a son just as Elisha had promised. One day, while the boy was still young, he was out in the fields with his father, where the workers were harvesting the crops. Suddenly he shouted,
My head hurts. It hurts a lot.
Carry him back to his mother.
The father said to his servant. The servant picked up the boy and carried him to his mother. The boy lay on her lap all morning, and by noon he was dead. She carried him upstairs to Elisha's room and laid him across the bed. Then she walked out and shut the door behind her. The woman called to her husband.
I need to see the prophet. Let me use one of the donkeys. Send a servant along with me and let me leave now so I can get back quickly.
Why do you need to see him today?
Her husband asked.
It's not the Sabbath or time for the new moon festival.
That's all right,
she answered. She saddled the donkey and said to her servant,
Let's go, and don't slow down unless I tell you to.
She left at once for Mount Carmel to talk with Elisha. When Elisha saw her coming, he said,
Gehazi, look, it's the woman from Shunem. Run and meet her, and ask her if everything is all right with her and her family.
Everything is fine,
she answered Gehazi. But as soon as she got to the top of the mountain, she went over and grabbed Elisha by the feet. Gehazi started toward her to push her away when Elisha said,
Leave her alone. Don't you see how sad she is? But the Lord hasn't told me why.
The woman said,
Sir, I begged you not to get my hopes up, and I didn't even ask you for a son.
Gehazi, get ready and go to her house.
Elisha said,
Take along my walking stick, and when you get there, lay it on the boy's face. Don't stop to talk to anyone, even if they try to talk to you.
But the boy's mother said to Elisha,
I swear by the living Lord and by your own life that I won't leave without you.
So Elisha got up and went with them. Gehazi ran on ahead and laid Elisha's walking stick on the boy's face, but the boy didn't move or make a sound. Gehazi ran back to Elisha and said,
The boy didn't wake up.
Elisha arrived at the woman's house and went straight to his room, where he saw the boy's body on his bed. He walked in, shut the door, and prayed to the Lord. Then he got on the bed and stretched out over the dead body, with his mouth on the boy's mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hand on his hands. As he lay there, the boy's body became warm. Elisha got up and walked back and forth in the room. Then he went back and leaned over the boy's body. The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Elisha called out to Gehazi,
Have the boy's mother come here.
Gehazi did, and when she was at the door, Elisha said,
You can take your son.
She came in and bowed down at Elisha's feet. Then she picked up her son and left. Later, Elisha went back to Gilgal, where there was almost nothing to eat because the crops had failed. One day, while the prophets who lived there were meeting with Elisha, he said to his servant,
Fix a big pot of stew for these prophets.
One of them went out into the woods to gather some herbs. He found a wild vine and picked as much of its fruit as he could carry, but he didn't know that the fruit was very sour. When he got back, he cut up the fruit and put it in the stew. The stew was served, and when the prophets started eating it, they shouted,
Elisha, this stew tastes terrible. We can't eat it.
Bring me some flour,
Elisha said. He sprinkled the flour in the stew and said, "Now serve it to them." And the stew tasted fine. A man from the town of Baal-Shalisha brought Elisha some freshly cut grain and 20 loaves of bread made from the first barley that was harvested. Elisha said,
"Give it to the people so they can eat."
"There's not enough here for 100 people,"
his servant said.
"Just give it to them,"
Elisha replied.
"The Lord has promised there will be more than enough."
So the servant served the bread and grain to the people. They ate and still had some left over, just as the Lord had promised. 2 Kings, chapter 5. Naaman was the commander of the Syrian army. The Lord had helped him and his troops defeat their enemies, so the king of Syria respected Naaman very much. Naaman was a brave soldier, but he had leprosy. One day, while the Syrian troops were raiding Israel, they captured a girl and she became a servant of Naaman's wife. Sometime later, the girl said,
"If your husband Naaman would go to the prophet in Samaria, he will be cured of his leprosy."
When Naaman told the king what the girl had said, the king replied,
"Go ahead. I will give you a letter to take to the king of Israel."
Naaman left and took along 750 pounds of silver, 150 pounds of gold, and 10 new outfits. He also carried the letter to the king of Israel. It said,
"I am sending my servant Naaman to you. Would you cure him of his leprosy?"
When the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes in fear and shouted,
"That Syrian king believes I can cure this man of leprosy. Does he think I'm God with power over life and death? He must be trying to pick a fight with me."
As soon as Elisha the prophet heard what had happened, he sent the Israelite king this message,
"Why are you so afraid? Send the man to me, so that he will know there is a prophet in Israel."
Naaman left with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent someone outside to say to him,
"Go wash 7 times in the Jordan River. Then you'll be completely cured."
But Naaman stormed off, grumbling,
"Why couldn't he come out and talk to me? I thought for sure he would stand in front of me and pray to the Lord his God, then wave his hand over my skin and cure me. What about the Abana River or the Pharpar River? Those rivers in Damascus are just as good as any river in Israel. I could have washed in them and been cured."
His servants went over to him and said,
"Sir, if the prophet had told you to do something difficult, you would have done it. So why don't you do what he said? Go wash and be cured."
Naaman walked down to the Jordan. He waded out into the water and stooped down in it 7 times, just as Elisha had told him. Right away he was cured, and his skin became as smooth as a child's. Naaman and his officials went back to Elisha. Naaman stood in front of him and announced,
"Now I know that the God of Israel is the only God in the whole world. Sir, would you please accept a gift from me?"
"I am a servant of the living Lord,"
Elisha answered,
"and I swear that I will not take anything from you."
Naaman kept begging, but Elisha kept refusing. Finally, Naaman said,
"If you won't accept a gift, then please let me take home as much soil as 2 mules can pull in a wagon. Sir, from now on I will offer sacrifices only to the Lord. But I pray that the Lord will forgive me when I go into the temple of the god Rimmon and bow down there with the king of Syria."
"Go on home, and don't worry about that,"
Elisha replied. Then Naaman left. After Naaman had gone only a short distance, Gehazi said to himself,
"Elisha let that Syrian off too easy. He should have taken Naaman's gift. I swear by the living Lord that I will talk to Naaman myself and get something from him."
So he hurried after Naaman. When Naaman saw Gehazi running after him, he got out of his chariot to meet him. Naaman asked,
"Is everything all right?"
"Yes,"
Gehazi answered.
"But my master has sent me to tell you about 2 young prophets from the hills of Ephraim. They came asking for help, and now Elisha wants to know if you would give them about 75 pounds of silver and some new clothes."
"Sure,"
Naaman replied.
"But why don't you take twice that amount of silver?"
He convinced Gehazi to take it all, then put the silver in 2 bags. He handed the bags and the clothes to his 2 servants, and they carried them for Gehazi. When they reached the hill where Gehazi lived, he took the bags from the servants and placed them in his house, then sent the men away. After they had gone, Gehazi went in and stood in front of Elisha, who asked,
"Gehazi, where have you been?"
"Nowhere, sir,"
Gehazi answered. Elisha asked,
"Don't you know that my spirit was there when Naaman got out of his chariot to talk with you? Gehazi, you have no right to accept money or clothes, olive orchards, a vineyard, sheep or cattle or servants, because of what you've done. Naaman's leprosy will now be on you and your descendants forever."
Suddenly Gehazi's skin became white with leprosy, and he left. 2 Kings, chapter 6. One day the prophets said to Elisha,
"The place where we meet with you is too small. Why don't we build a new meeting place near the Jordan River? Each of us could get some wood, then we could build it."
"That's a good idea,"
Elisha replied.
"Get started."
"Aren't you going with us?"
one of the prophets asked.
"Yes, I'll go,"
Elisha answered, and he left with them. They went to the Jordan River and began chopping down trees. While one of the prophets was working, his axe head fell off and dropped into the water.
"Oh!"
he shouted.
"Sir, I borrowed this axe."
"Where did it fall in?"
Elisha asked. The prophet pointed to the place, and Elisha cut a stick and threw it into the water at that spot. The axe head floated to the top of the water.
"Now get it,"
Elisha told him, and the prophet reached in and grabbed it. Time after time, when the king of Syria was at war against the Israelites, he met with his officers and announced,
"I've decided where we will set up camp."
Each time, Elisha would send this warning to the king of Israel:
"Don't go near there. That's where the Syrian troops have set up camp."
So the king would warn the Israelite troops in that place to be on guard. The king of Syria was furious when he found out what was happening. He called in his officers and asked,
"Which one of you has been telling the king of Israel our plans?"
"None of us, your majesty,"
one of them answered.
"It's an Israelite named Elisha. He's a prophet, so he can tell his king everything, even what you say in your own room."
"Find out where he is,"
the king ordered.
"I'll send soldiers to bring him here."
They learned that Elisha was in the town of Dothan and reported it to the king. He ordered his best troops to go there with horses and chariots. They marched out during the night and surrounded the town. When Elisha's servant got up the next morning, he saw that Syrian troops had the town surrounded.
"Sir, what are we going to do?"
he asked.
"Don't be afraid,"
Elisha answered.
"There are more troops on our side than on theirs."
Then he prayed,
"Lord, please help him to see."
And the Lord let the servant see that the hill was covered with fiery horses and flaming chariots all around Elisha. As the Syrian army came closer, Elisha prayed,
"Lord, make these soldiers blind."
And the Lord blinded them with a bright light. Elisha told the enemy troops,
"You've taken the wrong road and are in the wrong town. Follow me. I'll lead you to the man you're looking for."
Elisha led them straight to the capital city of Samaria. When all the soldiers were inside the city, Elisha prayed,
"Lord, now let them see again."
The Lord let them see that they were standing in the middle of Samaria. The king of Israel saw them and asked Elisha,
"Should I kill them, sir?"
"No,"
Elisha answered.
"You didn't capture these troops in battle, so you have no right to kill them. Instead, give them something to eat and drink, and let them return to their leader."
The king ordered a huge meal to be prepared for Syria's army, and when they finished eating, he let them go. For a while, the Syrian troops stopped invading Israel's territory. Sometime later, King Ben-Hadad of Syria called his entire army together. Then they marched to Samaria and attacked. They kept up the attack until there was nothing to eat in the city. In fact, a donkey's head cost about 2 pounds of silver, and a small bowl of pigeon droppings cost about 2 ounces of silver. One day, as the king of Israel was walking along the top of the city wall, a woman shouted to him,
"Please, Your Majesty, help me."
Let the Lord help you.
The king said.
Do you think I have grain or wine to give you?
Then he asked,
What's the matter anyway?
The woman answered,
"Another woman and I were so hungry that we agreed to eat our sons. She said if we ate my son one day, we could eat hers the next day. So yesterday we cooked my son and ate him. But today, when I went to her house to eat her son, she had hidden him."
The king tore off his clothes in sorrow, and since he was on top of the city wall, the people saw that he was wearing sackcloth underneath. He said,
I pray that God will punish me terribly if Elisha's head is still on his shoulders by this time tomorrow.
Then he sent a messenger to Elisha. Elisha was home at the time, and the important leaders of Israel were meeting with him. Even before the king's messenger arrived, Elisha told the leaders,
"That murderer is sending someone to cut off my head. When you see him coming, shut the door and don't let him in. I'm sure the king himself will be right behind him."
Before Elisha finished talking, the messenger came up and said,
"The Lord has made all these terrible things happen to us. Why should I think he will help us now?"